One of the biggest claims against the Bible is that it's so full of contradictions. For example, at the beginning of the Gospels, Jesus' family tree in Matthew looks completely different from Luke. And at the end, there seems to be conflicting accounts about what happened with the empty tomb. And some suggest there are many other contradictions in between. Now, in this video, we don't have time to break down every single accusation, but perhaps the most significant is about when Jesus was crucified. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all agree that Jesus was crucified on the day after Passover. However, John seems to say he was crucified on the day of preparation before Passover. So, if the Bible can't even agree on the most important details, like the day that Jesus died, then why should we trust any of it? Well, we'll answer that in just a second, but as you discover apparent contradictions in your own reading, I think it generally helps to think about it like this. If I ask you to share a story about the best day of your life, you may not tell it in the exact order that everything happened. You might not give exact quotations of what different people said, and you may not be precise on every single location. That would actually be a strange way of telling a story. Instead, you would emphasize certain aspects of the story that stood out to you. On top of that, the way that you tell the story would probably be different from the way somebody else would tell it. They might tell it in a different order, or perhaps they would paraphrase things differently or choose to be more general or specific about names and locations. Now, that doesn't mean that one of you is lying or is mistaken. Instead, it's more likely that the two of you are just simply emphasizing different parts of the story and telling it in your own way. And we could even take that a step further. The way that you might explain this day to someone from your hometown would probably be different from how you would explain it to someone from another state or country, depending on how familiar they are. Now, let's go back to the Gospels for a second. Most contradictions can be resolved when you think about them through that lens. Each gospel has a unique perspective on the story, and they're written to different audiences. It's no surprise then that we see some variation in these details. In fact, if we didn't see these kinds of subtleties, we'd be highly suspicious. Think about it this way: if four different witnesses told the exact same story, we would immediately assume they collaborated to get their story straight. But on the other hand, if these four witnesses have some variation, it's much more likely that they're telling the truth. And even more than that, those varying details often help us fill in the missing pieces in the story. So just because we may have some varying details in the Gospels, that doesn't mean that any of them are false or mistaken. It's just the opposite. The variation actually helps prove their trustworthiness and helps fill in the story with pieces that might otherwise be missing. However, some might say, I get your point, but what about those places in the Bible that are clearly in conflict with one another and cannot both be true? Well, it's important to remember that even blatantly contradictory information doesn't mean that you can't determine the truth or that their whole testimony is ruined. A detective could still piece together at least the most important things about what really happened. So even through supposed contradictions, we would still have enough evidence for the case of Christ. But I think it's even simpler than that. See, just because you personally can't find a way to reconcile a contradiction, that doesn't mean that a solution doesn't exist. A detective dealing with conflicting accounts doesn't automatically assume one is false. Instead, if their testimony has proven to be trustworthy and reliable in almost every other detail, then perhaps the detective just doesn't have enough information yet or needs more clarification. And that's true when reading the Gospels. So let's get back to that example. What about the day that Jesus died? Well, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are very clear. Jesus died the day after Passover. However, John 19:14 clearly says that Jesus was crucified on the day of preparation of the Passover. So the first three say Friday, John seems to say Wednesday, and that seems like an irresolvable contradiction. But let's think about it for a moment. First of all, we have to remember the Passover often referred not just to a single meal on a single day, but the week-long celebration. Along with that, we should also note that the day of preparation often refers to the day before Sabbath, where everything had to be made ready and prepared on Friday so that no work would be done on the seventh day of rest. The sixth day, Friday, then became known as the day of preparation. So looking back at John 19:14, notice it doesn't actually say that Jesus died on the day of preparation specifically for the Passover meal. It says he died on the day of preparation of Passover, meaning the day of preparation for the Sabbath of Passover week. Now, maybe that seems a bit nuanced, but that's just one example that shows all four Gospels are in agreement here. Jesus was crucified on Friday, the day of preparation for the Sabbath, during that week-long celebration of Passover, signifying the ultimate deliverance of God's people from sin and promising an eternal day of Sabbath rest with God. So, if you ever find some contradiction that seems irresolvable to you, rather than being overly skeptical, maybe dig a little deeper, because there's probably something that you're missing. It may have to do with the language, geography, or culture of that time, just minor details that need clarification. And for the skeptic, maybe that's not enough for you. Maybe that's not something that's convincing. But I would close with this. Number one, no differences in any of these accounts affect any essential truth about the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. If they did, Christianity would have faded out a long time ago. And number two, if the Gospels prove trustworthy and reliable on the vast majority of details, then doesn't that suggest there is some solution for every other apparent contradiction as well? In other words, if that much evidence points to harmonization across these four accounts, then doesn't it actually go against reason and take even more faith to believe that a small handful could prove the whole thing false? The bottom line, I think, is this. We all have uncertainties. We all have questions and should seek good answers. But rather than putting so much faith in our own skepticism, maybe we need to take a step back and make sure we're seeing the Bible through a fair lens and never allow our doubt to obscure our discovery of the truth.